Hi there, everybody. It's Colin McKeown with the New Fly Fisher. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Facebook Live event. This is our third one, and the first time we're going to do it in the evening. We partially did this to accommodate everyone that's across the country, but also because of you, George, because you were on the river today. So, so tonight's focus is going to be all about Euro Nymphing. I met George. I guess it was 2 years ago, on the Farmington River in Connecticut, and had one of my first introductions to Euro Nymphing and learned a lot in that weekend with you and Jesse Howler from Orvis. And I got to tell you, it's one of the most effective ways of nymph fishing for, well, at least that's what I've experienced, and obviously a lot of people out there, and the interest in it is so huge. So, George, you've come to be known as one of the faces of Euro Nymphing or contact fishing, or contact nymphing. Probably the best thing is, George, why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of Euro Nymphing and why this has become so popular?
No, well, thanks for having me on, Colin. There's a few things when it comes to the history. I mean, in short, when you talk about European nymphing, the techniques and tactics that we talk about have been in place for a long time. I mean, when you read about Frank Sawyer fishing his rivers in England years ago, he was fishing with a 12-foot bamboo rod and so forth. The main concept isn't evolved, basically. There have been people in California that have used this technique for years. My mentor, Joe Humphreys, and his mentor, George Harvey, were using this back in the 30s and the 40s. The main idea is we're keeping all the line leader off the water as possible. And as you know, what we're trying to do is achieve a deep drift closer to stream bottom. And one of the best ways you can do that is simply reduce surface tension. And the best way to do that is minimize the amount of line leader on the water. And when you're able to do that, not only are you able to get your flies down deeper, but you're able to hold them down deeper, slower, in those deeper runs better than any other technique available. There's definitely limitations we can definitely talk about a little bit later on, but it's a very simple, straightforward technique to achieve maximum depth and keep your flies down as deep as possible. When it talks about the evolution, we talked about the history for a while, but recently it's the advancement in the tools and some of the materials that we use that really have refined this technique. And the comparison I always talk about is like Steve Jobs with Apple. He didn't invent music, but he reinvented the way people listen to music with the iPad or the iPod. So same thing with European nymphing. This technique has been around, but the longer, lighter rods, because what we are trying to do for the most part is we are trying to reduce as much mass in the guides and also outside the guides. The less mass, whether it's a very thin fly line or basically using an all monofilament system, the whole idea is the less mass you have in the guides and outside the rod tip, the less, basically the less sag you have between rod tip and flies, and then also the less counter pull you have pulling the flies off the bottom. And what you need is a rod that is designed to basically cast minimal amount of weight. Most traditional fly rods are designed to cast fly lines and so forth. What we are looking for is a rod that can load with minimal amount of weight. And once we can cast, what's nice about these softer rod tips is the sensitivity. The sensitivity is outrageous compared to the traditional 10-foot 4-weight, 10-foot 5-weight rods I was using when I started competing back in 2004, 2005. These rod tips are so flexible that you can make that short little flip with those lightweight nymphs. But when you're watching your sighter or whatever color monofilament you're using as your indicator, those softer tips, you can see that sighter just dance and hesitate because that tip allows that interplay to occur. So you can just read those drifts so much better than what you can with a traditional fast action fly rod. And I don't want to get too technical with the fly rods, but the cool thing about this as well, as you know, it's a short range presentation where you're casting, flipping, and leading. And you're doing this repeatedly over hours and hours. And if you're fishing a rod that requires mass to cast like a traditional action fly rod, you have got to really work to get that rod tip to flex to make the cast. But what is so nice about these rods is all you need is just basically a flip of the wrist. They are designed to just cast off the tip of the rod. So the casting is effortlessly and incredibly sensitive, and it is allowed to really has allowed anglers to really refine their tippets and their leaders, even to the point now, like most of my leaders I'm running are we're not even using tapered leaders. We're basically often just using like level 6-pound test monofilament to a sighter and our small diameter tippet. And again, that small diameter, that small diameter leader and tippet, it just gives you such a straight line connection, and it just enhances your strike detection. So strike detection with these new rods and equipment has just elevated the nymphing game up several steps.
So George, I'd almost think you'd said that before, the way you hammered that machine gun of information. Thank you. That was great. Now I got to tell you, that wasn't a criticism about that. It was just me. It was so much information. It was wonderful. I think there's a few things you said in there that kind of struck me, and probably the best one that comes to my mind right off the top was when you were talking about how using monofilament or using very thin diameter running lines. And right away, it triggered in my mind years and years ago when I met Jeff Blood, who I know you've met before, obviously in Pennsylvania. And he took me steelheading the first time. And I showed up in the river. I think I had a 7-weight or 8-weight rod. And I was using a regular weight forward fly line. And he came over and said, you can't do that. And that night, because he was telling me all about the resistance and it was interfering with how I was presenting and drifting even the fly. And that was with an indicator. And that night he cut off the head of my fly line, and I just used the running line. But boy, it just changed the dynamics of how I was feeling the indicator and the rig going down in that current, looking for the steelhead. And obviously this is the same thing, right? Where the resistance, the feel, everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. The sensitivity, but again, it's just, like you were saying, like Jeff, anytime you have line leader on the water, increased surface drag, but even a traditional fly line outside the rod tip with that little bit of sag, that is a dead space, and that causes a significant delay. And what is so cool about this system is that when you're drifting these flies, and that's the key, like with the European nymphing, I would say probably the biggest progression in the last couple of years is going really small. When I started competing in 2005, 2006, the big thing was the traditional Czech nymphing, Polish nymphing, just kind of casting these heavy, large larva patterns, chucking and kind of leading along. Here, you have seen such a refinement in these techniques to the point where these anglers are not dredging heavily weight of flies, but they are drifting your flies. You just like almost visualize like a dry fly, how it just drifts naturally in the water column without inducing drag. What these guys are able to do, and ladies are able to do, is drift a nymph to the point where, because there's virtually no sag, we're using these tiny little perdigons, tiny little mayfly nymphs, very thin body, but this is a 2.5 or like a 3/32 tungsten bead. Yeah. No additional weight. This is all I've been fishing water that's probably 2.5 to 3 feet deep on depth with medium current. This is all the weight I've been basically need to get down to the bottom, just because of how little mass I have in that guides. And what is so cool about this is because of how light this fly is. Once it's in the current, the current is moving it. All we are doing with the rod tip is we're not dragging it. We're just staying ahead or above it. And you're just watching that sighter. You're just watching those flies as twitch. And when that fish strikes, you just see that sighter just stop. It is just incredibly sensitive. So this is one of these techniques that you're not going, because you're drifting lighter weight flies, you are rarely going to be feeling the strike because there's just not that much pull. But instead, what you're doing with these rods and these light systems, it just allows you to see that strike before you feel it. And as you know, in hard fish waters, often by the time you feel that strike or that indicator goes down too deep, that fish has already spit out that fly. But here, this just gives you that split-second reaction time. So again, pretty cool stuff.
You said something that really struck me, and that is, a lot of people get into fly fishing. Everyone's about the dry fly fishing and, the exhilaration of seeing the fish come up and eat it dry, wherever it is, Pennsylvania, Colorado, up here in Canada. But people who have got into Euro nymphing and really been successful have told me that they've got the same sense of exhilaration. Yeah. And you're showing it right here. You're demonstrating with the way you're talking about just being able to take such a small fly, get it in the water column, it's drifting the correct way, and you see that take, and boom, it works, right?
Yeah, it's great. It's a thinking person's game too, and not to knock indicators, because I use indicators on a regular basis. But what is so cool about this tight line system is when you're fishing an indicator, you're fishing your fly at a fixed depth, and once you put that line leader in the water, the indicator basically you'll mend and do some other things, but that indicator basically fishes the fly out for you. But what is so cool about this system is we don't have an indicator or some surface area dragging our nymphs. You are in charge of leading the flies. And this is where you have just got to be like in the zone. So you're reading the surface currents, you're reading the stream bottom, and you're having to guess how high or how shallow, how fast. And because of that, it just forces you to kind of just suck in all your focus into one zone, and you become, into the zone, and you just become so focused on that task. And when the fish strikes, it is just, I guess you could say there's a lot more effort that goes into it. And because of that, when you get those great results, because of the amount of effort in it, you feel like you've accomplished more. Because you figured out a section of water and you've done a lot more work. So it's kind of a greater reward for me, at least.
Well, I think there's a lot of people are finding it's the same thing for them as well when they've experimented with this technique, or this, as I like to call, a tool in the toolbox. Yeah. But, probably we should do at this point, George, because there's so much to cover here. Some people are asking some great questions, and a gentleman from New Hampshire, where it is, he was asking, what is the shallowest depth that you would consider Euro nymphing to be effective?
Oh, so I'm typically, like on the stream that I do a lot of my work on, it's called Spring Creek. This is a stream where every stream has its own characteristics and personalities, but there are even days today where we were kicking out fish that were literally in an inch and a half of water. They were up on the shallows looking for insects falling off the bank, or we're basically just nymphing in kind of the sandy, silty water. But I've done this technique a lot, and not only, but doing sight fishing essentially in water that's about 1 to 2 inches in depth. So I use this technique a lot in shallow water. It just has lots of applications, and one of the great applications for shallow water is that in shallow water, those fish, it's like a dry fly eater coming up near the surface. When those fish are in that shallow water, their heightened sense of alertness is increased because they know they're in the danger zone. They're no longer in the comforts of the depth. So their sense of awareness is even heightened. And anytime you put an indicator or a fly line on the water and water types like that, often you're spooking fish. So what better way to fish shallow water than basically being able to present the fly, keeping all the line leader off the water, and having nothing but just a small, lightly weighted nymph, or sometimes unweighted nymph, hit the water and have that be your only cause of impact. So definitely shallow water is a technique I use this a lot in.
Thanks, George. And thanks for the question, Bruce. Lily Munster asked a question about Euro nymphing, and she's saying she's got 3 pounds in a sucker, but she didn't feel any of the strikes. And if I could speak to that as a neophyte of Euro nymphing, I had the same thing, Lily. I'm still learning it, and it's kind of like when I was mentioning Jeff Blood, when he first was giving me much enhanced skills in indicator fishing. It takes a while to get the feel for it and to read those little telegraph signals coming up through your leader to let you know you've had a strike. But that's my personal opinion. George, what would you like to say about that?
I think that's a great point. And just remembering, like, you're not going to feel strikes all the time. The only time you're going to be feeling strikes is when you were fishing lots of weight. And she said, I think she had 3 pounds of test or 3 pounds of lead wire. So, I mean, you'd have to see it, but there's a number of things that could be happening. Even if you have lots of weight, if you're fishing heavy anchor flies or lots of split shot, and if you're not feeling the strikes, that just tells me, one, immediately that your line control is off. You don't have contact between the rod tip and the nymph. Because anytime you have even a fairly heavily weighted fly, as long as that rod tip is in position either straight up or straight downstream, if you have any degree of tension on a heavily weighted rig, you should feel a strike. And if you don't, that tells you that you are out of touch with your flies completely. But the other thing is, when you're fishing these lighter weight flies, one of the things that you need to strive for, again, we're talking about a natural drift, is about rod tip angle relative to where the flies are. And what I mean by that is this: with traditional tight line techniques, we were always taught to cast upstream and lead the flies. And when you see, if you're doing that, and this is just your sighter, but if you see your sighter at a shallow angle like this, like angled far upstream, no matter how much effort you're putting downstream, anytime you have an angle like this, you are still putting a high degree of tension on those flies. Even this thin monofilament, as it's hanging, that gravity right there is forcing the fly to come up. So one of the things to really increase your sensitivity also is to strive for more of a vertical presentation. What I mean by that is as soon as you cast upstream, you can leave the rod tip a little bit, but strive to actually elevate the rod tip so you're getting that sighter directly vertical, or basically the flies directly under the rod tip. Think about the rod tip almost like an indicator. You're just holding this sighter, and this sighter is your depth gauge. If you're not fishing deep enough, you can lower it. If you need to go higher in the water column, you can heighten it. But when you're fishing straight up and down like that, you have direct contact. There is no sag whatsoever. And when the fish strikes, you're going to see that. When that fish strikes, I mean, it's pulling straight down. There is absolutely no guesswork. So strive for that vertical position, but then also, you know, it's about casting techniques. And I can tell you, one of the biggest mistakes we all deal with, things I do personally, and then also clients and my guests, is when you cast in these weighted flies is having contact and control from the very beginning. Because what happens so often, people want to cast, they want to overpower the cast. They get this kickback, there's a disconnect. Now the rod tip has to move so far before you get in contact. Mm-hmm. The key with this approach is you are just flinging the weight. You are reducing all body movement. You're not trying to overpower the cast. The hand is out right here, and all you're doing is just flipping the cast. And when you do things correctly, in a perfect world, you're aiming up. Your rod tip stops high. And when your rod tip stops high, you should see that sighter. As soon as those flies land, that sighter should be, boom, tight. It should sink. And when you see that sighter nice and tight off the water under some degree of tension, that tells me that you have contact. But if you're placing the sighter on the water, dropping it, you're getting kicked back, and then you're ripping the rod tip off the water, you're not having control. And again, the big thing here is just making a smooth presentation cast, reducing the kickback. And that'd probably be one of the best tips I can give you if you're feeling like there's a disconnect. Because when there's a disconnect, it's because you're not doing your job with the presentation to put you in touch from the very beginning.
Okay, so there's been some questions asked that connect to what you were just talking about. One is about the rod and arm position and how that relates to, obviously, when you're going through the drift, but also the cast. And then the other aspect was somebody's asking about how close you can get to the fish without spooking. And then another question was related to the shallow water, which, I mean, these are all combinations of things and factors that you have in different streams. But if you're fishing in shallow water, you can't use weighted flies. You must be using unweighted flies. So there's multiple questions here, but they're all connected. Can you talk about that? You know, so like the presentation, where your rod and arm is. And if, by the way, when you're talking about where you're stopping, it made me think right away of the tuck cast, right? And what Joe Humphreys and others have taught. But it's a little bit different what you're talking about here. It's a tuck cast, but it's not. But it's getting it to get lob. I hate to say this, but lob the flies in such a way so, like you said, it's immediately on the bottom, and you've got direct contact, and your sight is straight.
Correct. See, Joe,
talk about all these points. I'd appreciate it, George.
No, absolutely. See, what you need to understand with Joe is he's a master of regaining control. So it's like a game of golf. I mean, golf is a game of recovery, as I've heard it being said. But with Joe, when he makes his tuck cast, he intentionally overpowers the cast. So when the flies come, they literally kick under the rod tip, putting slack in that system, allowing the flies to drop down on the bottom. But what Joe has the incredible ability to do is he knows how much slack to give to let his flies drop, but he knows exactly that sweet spot where he needs to move the rod tip quickly to regain control before he goes in the sweet spot. I don't have that sense of control, and a lot of people I don't as well. So one of the things we can do is, instead of intentionally throwing lots of slack in there like a tuck cast, what we can do is we can still increase the force of the cast, but instead of getting the flies to tuck under, once we make a good hard line cast, instead of immediately leading the flies downstream because the current is moving towards us, all I'm going to simply do is just elevate the rod tip. And what I mean by that is, instead of the rod tip moving downstream, putting tension on those flies, and now allowing the flies to truly free fall, because, you know, I've said this 100 times before, but even if you take an unweighted nymph, a very lightly weighted nymph in fast moving water, if I just drop this thing just like that, it's not going to get swept downstream. It's going to basically drift a foot, and then it's going to fall down because nothing's attached to it. It's basically allowing it to plummet down to the surface. You need to think about the same thing with your nymph fishing. You don't want to just cast and lead. When the flies start drifting, all we're going to do is, instead of moving directly downstream, we're just going to elevate the rod tip up, directly straight up. And what that is doing, it's managing the slack as those flies drop. So you're allowing the flies to free fall, but you're doing it, in my opinion, with control. rather than just inducing slack and just hoping for the best. Again, Joe is a master at that. I've tried his technique for years with that tuck cast. So I just kind of went to a different position where I can kind of have control from the very beginning of the flies laying on the water and just elevating and allowing those flies to drop. And what's cool about, at least with that approach, is this is the time of the year, like April, May, where you have your peak hatches. So many times, it's like bass fishing. So many of your strikes when you're fishing plastics, in my experience, is when you're fishing your flies actually on the fall, when the flies are dropping. Yeah. And when you're fishing indicators or when you're overpowering and you're inducing a high tuck cast, you're dropping your flies, but you have no control with your flies. But with this approach, when you stop and you just slowly elevate, as those flies drop and the fish strikes, you still have that strike detection. So it gives you a controlled slack on the drop. So that's one of the things I like to do is just, instead of using that tuck cast, I still use a forceful cast, but I don't intentionally pull the rod tip back and get the flies to kick. I just shoot the fly down.
Yeah.
And I have contact from the very beginning. And instead of leading, I just elevate to allow the flies to drop to the level I want them to go. In hand position and rod position, I mean, it varies greatly. But one of the things I've really worked on in the last couple of years is when you're working with a tight line system, I've gone more to exclusively using like a line hand as well. And what I mean by that is when you're using a traditional, let me move this back here, but when you're using a traditional cast, you're cast upstream and to control the drift, you're elevating the rod tip to manage the slack as it comes back. When you do that, there's a couple things that are happening. One is as you're casting your lead and you're elevating, the higher the rod tip, especially when you're fishing windier conditions, every time that rod tip continues to elevate, you are creating a bigger sail over and over for that wind to affect. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that when a fish strikes, how many times have we let the flies through the drift and then rod tips elevated to the max and the fish eats right at your foot and you've got absolutely no lever to set the hook? Or maybe you're fishing small streams and you're fishing under limbs that are 5-6 feet in depth. You can't elevate the rod tip because the rod tip's going to be hitting the limbs. So one of the things I've really played around with in the last couple of years is relying more when I make this cast to actually use a small hand and twist retrieve. The rod tip is basically, I'm not stopping the rod tip overly high. I'm just kind of keeping the rod tip at an angle where I can keep most of the line leader off the water that I'm fishing. But instead of leading with the rod tip and elevate, everything's done right here. It's all hand and twist retrieve. And the reason why I like the hand and twist retrieve is because it's a smooth, continuous retrieve. When you are drifting this and you start using a strip retrieve, it's like when you watch your streamer, you see the line twitch and move. When you use a strip or like a pole with this technique, you're going to see that sighter or your indicator twitch and hesitate. You don't want that. The only time you want to see that line leader hesitate is when a fish strikes. And by making that cast and just using a smooth, continuous hand and twist retrieve, there's no bumps, there's no direct movement in that sighter. So the moment that line hesitates or that sighter hesitates, I know instinctively to set the hook because it's very likely a fish. Other than that, when you're talking about fishing upstream, if you do need to use the rod tip is going to be basically, you're going to be elevating the rod tip because the current is moving basically towards you. So the rod tip is going to be elevated if you do need to use the rod hand. If you're fishing more directly across or you're fishing across stream, the rod tip is going to be sometimes almost parallel to the water. Because if I'm casting across stream and I begin elevating that rod tip, I'm literally pulling those flies towards me. So the moral of the story is most of the time if I'm fishing directly upstream, I can have a higher rod tip angle. But if I'm fishing more and across, that rod tip is going to be almost parallel, holding it over the water because I don't want to induce drag most of the time. And this is assuming you want a natural drift. If I want to swing my flies or create induced tension, you can cast over and across and you can elevate the rod tip, but not when you're trying to achieve a natural drift. Hopefully that answers a few of those questions.
I think it does. It certainly did for me. Again, I'm very much in the learning mode on this whole thing. And George, I think there's been a number of great questions asked. And one that I'm really focused on here is fishing deeper pools. Like I think of some of the places I've fished in Pennsylvania, some of the rivers, and I know this would be super easy and deadly where it's, 6 inches to 3 feet deep, even 4 feet deep. But what happens when you get into a place where you've got a deep pool, maybe slower moving water? What are your recommendations how to fish that effectively with nymphs?
Sure. So, definitely as we're talking about with the European nymphing system, so this is where definitely state rules, regulations kind of dictate this. But when I'm normally fishing pools, I mean, don't get me wrong, fish that are holding in pools will feed, but usually the fish that I'm after that are happy or actively feeding move out of those pools, the shallows, to the banks, to the tails, or to the heads of the runs, and a lot of these runs. Normally, fish that are in the pools, in my experience, in my waters, are typically a little more lethargic, especially like in the wintertime, the fish that are holding the slower, deeper pools. That is a time where I think you really need to slow grind your presentation. A lot of what we're talking about with this lightweight system is essentially drifting your flies. This is the time of the year here in central PA where we have the bulk of our hatches. Fish are more willing to look up in the water column. But when you are fishing those slow pools, when those fish are down deep, I think you need to slow grind. And this is where I will switch gears. And this is where I will tend to use a drop shot, or what some people call a bottom bouncing technique. Again, different rules apply, but you are putting the split shot on the bottom of the leader and essentially just kind of grinding along and dragging that shot along the bottom. And the best way I can explain this is, I mean, there's been a couple of days, on some of our local rivers in the wintertime, I love throwing streamers. It's one of my favorite things to do. But there were 2 days last year, just cold days, very little trout activity. I'm fishing two streamers. The only 2 trout I caught all damn day were both situations where I'm casting over, down, across, and my point streamer gets stuck on brush vegetation, and I'm trying to get the fly off, just trying to move it around. And sure enough, because that fly was stalled there and it just stayed there wiggling, a fish somehow, because that fly was there basically wiggling for 20, 30 seconds before that another fish came up and hit my dropper. So I think what the drop shot technique does is that when you are slow grinding, when you're putting the shot on the bottom and you're fishing lighter weight flies off the droppers, it just allows you to stall your flies. And to the point where even when I'm fishing streamers, what's nice, or fishing nymphs, when I'm casting up, I will literally just drag my split shot, because that's what you're doing. You're just dragging the split shot. And anytime I make several passes, no luck whatsoever, I will intentionally cast and basically just drag it into position, hold it tight, and just let it set right there. And this is where you're using unweighted flies. And those unweighted flies and those currents are just going to stay there dangling. It's almost like a down and across technique you use for steelhead to kind of basically just kind of stall and just irritate the fish. But I use that drop shot technique exclusively in situations where those fish are just not on the move. And I'm just trying to stall my flies and try to just irritate them to the point of taking the fly or spooking them. But normally that is kind of one of my approaches, technically to approach fish in pools that are just usually not on the feed.
Yeah, and I would agree with you, by the way. Most of the time, my success has been at the head or the tail. And, there may be fish in the bottom of the pool in those elbows or wherever, but they're parked and they're just not eating, generally.
Yep, correct.
But that being said, it's still good information to know about. Sometimes there are opportunities where you can catch the fish. They just, like you said, could be weather, temperature, whatever, has put them down the bottom. Got lots of questions here. One of the ones that came out was about how many flies, and obviously state or provincial regulations dictate a lot about how many flies you can use. But I know for steelheading, I always was using 2 flies, and as I'm learning to Euro Nymph, I'm sticking to 2 flies right now. I'd like to go to 3 flies, but I'm finding I'm having too many tangles, and I'm trying to get my skill sets up at tying and retying and things like that. So could you address that and about what you find is the optimum number of flies to run, when, where, why?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, you could write a book on this. This is fun stuff. This is kind of the geeky stuff, but a couple things to also consider is your position of your flies. So, usually when I'm nymphing, I'm usually using a heavier fly and a lighter weight fly. And what I mean by that is usually the streams that I'm fishing, smaller streams, but fairly broken pocket water. There are some, kind of even keel sections of water, but for a lot of the water I fish, there's quite a bit of broken water. And when I'm fishing seams that are close by and you have maybe like 4 or 5 different speed currents within a fairly short area, I like to focus my weight in the one point. I like to have one anchor point rather than putting 2 flies, equal amount of weight in 2 areas. Because what happens, like in pocket water, in my experience, it's like fishing 2 dry flies in pocket water. You can make a cast one fly gets in one current, pulls in one direction, another fly lands in a different current, pulls in a different direction. The same thing happens with your nymphs. You get micro drag below the surface, but because we're fishing nymphs, you don't see it nearly as much. But usually when you're fishing pocket water, you can fish 2 flies, but I like to put all the weight basically, or most of the weight in one spot. So I have one pinch point. That's going to create my anchor. And then I'll put a lighter weight fly either on the top dropper or, off the bend, off the backside. But that one focus point kind of keeps your flies in that strike zone. And I believe it creates less drag, subsurface drag with your nymphs. But when you're fishing nymphs, the other thing is most of the time I put my heaviest fly in the point. Different people have different approaches, but the reason why I like the heaviest fly in the point, it keeps your entire line fairly tight. So that means when you're fishing with a European nymphing approach, heaviest fly in the point, anytime you are adding a dropper or fishing a fly higher up or away from it, when you're fishing that fly higher up, if it's 20 inches, that means potentially you could be fishing that fly 17 to 20 inches above the point fly. If you're fishing early in the day and those fish are not lifting, they're not elevating, fishing a second fly higher in the water column is going to do nothing but just double your chances of getting tangles, in my opinion. So usually early in the day, I'm fishing a single fly. And like today, when I was on the water with my guy, I started seeing some flashes. I started seeing a little bit of surface activity, saw a few bugs moving. As soon as I saw that, that's when, we already had a dropper attached, but that's when I added basically a very lightly weighted, sulfur emerger on the point, and we started taking fish on that dropper. But normally, heaviest fly in the point, fishing 2 flies, but usually only fish a second fly when there's actually higher levels of trout activity.
That's great advice, especially as you're pointing people to understand the peak times of when to do that based on when the insects are emerging and things like that. And like you said, the fish are looking up. What advice would you have if it's later in the season and say we're out in Montana, you're fishing a river and you're not seeing a hatch, but would 2 flies apply? Like, would you want to use that to try and do a little bit of searching?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience out west, it fishes a little bit different than the east. Fish, in the east, if they're not moving, if I'm not seeing any activity, they're not usually coming up, at least on the spring creeks I'm fishing. But I would say the freestone streams, freestone streams are streams where there's less activity, or maybe, especially if there's a cold night, whenever you have a shorter window of feeding opportunity throughout the day, that's typically what I find, especially like on freestone streams, out west, early morning, usually, even in the summer, like you get there at 7 o'clock in the morning, it's usually not very good for me, at least. It usually takes a little bit. But when it does heat up, and even if there's not insects rising, those fishes, that metabolism is up, water temperatures are up. So I will definitely, when I'm out west, I almost always have a kind of a dull color pattern, but on my dropper, I'm almost always exclusively fishing some flashier, gaudier, something with a holographic flashback, but definitely prospect out west for sure. And typically that's the way I like to fish anyway. If I see different levels of trout activity, I tend to fish one darker, more natural pattern, and then on my dropper, if I am fishing a dropper other than a merger, I'm going to be using some pattern like a rainbow warrior, like a mylar Princeton, but something that's going to reflect light and hopefully get the attention of the fish.
Okay, thank you. That was really good. And we got lots of other questions here. I'll tell you what, there was a gentleman made a point that I thought was really good. He was talking about how he said this is just a new name for an old technique. And I remember talking to Joe Humphreys about this years and years ago, but his style and using the hand crawl and doing the tuck cast and all those things. And I said to him, well, is this just something else or something else? Just like everyone says it about fly patterns, right? I got a new fly pattern. It's like, oh, it's something else. Probably it is, obviously. And other people have had other ideas. Do you want to address this and just, because to me, this is part of the history of it. It's an evolution to get to where we are, and it just keeps getting refined.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've already talked about this before, but you compare it with Steve Jobs. But yeah, I mean, Frank Sawyer, all these skews, when he's basically stuck his middle finger up to the angling world, to Halford and all those guys and say, hey, I'm going to fish a fly below the surface. That's basically, when nymphing has been, and I guarantee you the Neanderthals in Europe were doing this, hundreds and hundreds of years before that at some point. But again, it's just like you were saying, when I talked to Joe about this, Joe was like, I was Czech nymphing before the Czech Republic was a country. And that is so true. It is a fact. But it's just the advancement, as we were talking about. They talk about European nymphing, but it's just, I think one of the reasons is it's such a deadly technique, and the competition kind of brought this to the forefront. And because of the competition being high-level competition, and it has forced refinement. You look at bass fishing. I mean, bass fishing hasn't changed. Bass haven't changed. But you look at the tools and the gadgets and the gizmos that these guys and ladies are using every year, it just keeps getting deadlier and deadlier every year. And that's the same thing what we're doing with these flies, these rods, these refined rods that cast very thin leaders, these incredibly small diameter cider materials, the Perdigon style patterns, these small diameter flies that are allowing them to drop. It's the same thing, but like you're saying, it's just a refinement, making things easier and more efficient every year. And in my opinion, even deadlier than what, and I guarantee you go onto a river system and you take, old Joe Brooks, who was an amazing angler, or George Harvey's, and you have them fish their traditional, weight forward fly line, split shot, they're going to catch a pile of fish. But I guarantee you take that same angler, you put Joe Brooks, and he works on casting these small, lightly weighted flies and this refined technique, his strike detection, even though the technique is going to be almost the same, his strike detection is going to be enhanced, 5, 6, 7-fold, just because of the techniques and the tools that we're using.
Yeah. A whole bunch more questions, and I'll get to them. Everyone, I'll get to them. I'll try. Anyways, George, and I'm sure you've experienced this in other Facebook events you've been in. But I think one of the things that you brought up several times, I think people want to know, and I get asked about it. Do you need to get a Czech nymphing rod? Do you need to get all these things? And I guess what I'm telling people is kind of like trying, people want to get a fast action rod for casting streamers and this and that. But do I need to get that rod, or can I just use my regular rod, especially at the start? And I know my opinion is that I don't think you need to do that. Obviously, you need, the cider material and some of the other, the flies and that. But just to get started, if you've got a 9-foot 5-weight rod that you're using for regular trout fishing, that should be the way to start, right?
Yeah, you can use any rod. I mean, when I started competing in 2005, I mean, the rods that we were using were traditional fast action fly rods. It's really only within the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years where everyone now is coming up with just fantastic nymphing rods. But you're absolutely right. If you want to get started with this, I mean, you can start off with if you have a 7.5-foot Fenwick fiberglass rod that your grandfather gave you from years ago, it can work, definitely work. You'll just find that less strike detection. And, and what we're just simply splitting hairs. That's all we're doing is we're splitting hairs. You can easily accomplish the task and catch fish and have a great time with these rods. But I guarantee you, as soon as you switch gears and you fish with one of these, Euro style rods, whatever you want to call them, with a thin leader formula, it's going to be a little easier to cast, and you're just going to see your strikes so much easier. That's all.
Okay. So, George, I don't know if you can see the feed that's over here on the other side of the screen. Lots of questions here, and I'm sorry we're not keeping up, everyone, from YouTube and Facebook. Why don't we go? We'll start from the bottom here. Lee has asked a question about talking about the length of his leader that you're running. I know that's a pretty generic question because it really depends upon conditions and everything, but could you give him a bit of a sense of what to do?
So
yeah.
So the big thing with this, with the fly line is this, either you're going to run a fairly short leader. So if you're using like a European nymphing line, and what you'll find is, again, I play devil's advocate. When I talk about things, I'm always experimenting, trying different formulas. But the key is if you're using fly line, the fly line needs to be partly outside the rod tip, so it anchors out, so the line doesn't go through the guides. You don't ever want any fly line within the guides, even the European nymphing line, because even if you're casting and you're keeping a higher rod tip or even a shallower angle rod tip, any of that line in the guides is going to come down and basically create a counter pull. So usually if I'm using a Euro line, and I tend to use Euro lines a lot, especially in the wintertime, because we're talking about hand and twist control. I find that monofilaments, especially when it's like 30 degrees outside, it's damp, my hands aren't working. it is very difficult for me to control that monofilament, which has has a memory, smaller diameter, and it's difficult for me to manage that with my line hand. So that's when I'm often using a lot of the Euro lines, because it just gives me a fly line feel. It gives me something better to hold on to, easier to hold on to. But when I'm doing that with a Euro line, my leaders are going to be short, maybe 8 to 10 feet at the max. I'm running maybe a level section of 12-pound test, 4 feet of 12-pound test maxima, a short section of cider, and then maybe another 3 to 4 feet of tippet to my fly or flies. Very short. If you are fishing and you want to go all mono, the whole idea is you don't want any fly line in the guide. So that means your leaders might be in excess of 20, 25 feet. But the whole idea is either fly line is outside the rod tip or it's in the reel and not within the guides. So it's going to be very short or incredibly long, in my opinion.
Wow. Evan asked about tips on downstream approaches, drifts, and larger creeks, such as the Little J down there in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I get over the J a handful of times every year. You know, on some of these sections, especially the downstream presentations, I mean, you can, and we talk about tight line nymphing being more of an upstream approach, but you can obviously drift downstream. And once it goes below you with a longer rod, you can lower the rod to kind of feed the drift into the slack, but you're very limited to the range of your leader and the length of your rod. Usually 10 to 12 feet downstream of me is kind of the max where I can effectively like drift before tension sets in and swings my flies out. So anytime I'm on the Henry's Fork, I'm on the Delaware, on the South Holston, anywhere where I really need a downstream presentation, I almost exclusively fish a dry dropper or an indicator rig, because that is going to do a far better job controlling my drift below me than what I can kind of controlling the slack and feeding the slack into the presentation. So almost all my downstream presentations, most of them will have some sort of suspension device that I can kind of feed the slack into the drift.
Okay, thanks, George, and good question, Evan. We also have another question up here about when you're Euro nymphing. David's asking, you feel like you need to switch to streamers or dries. What's the easiest way to do that? I mean, can you do that if I'm using a 10-foot 3-weight rod? Obviously, is there going to be some challenges doing this? Obviously, not casting weighted streamers, but can you reasonably do that?
Oh, you definitely can. I mean, I geek out. I mean, I did something on my YouTube clip for when Penn State was remote. I had to do some field trips, and I showed actually fishing a Granum hatch, which is our caddis hatch, but using a Euro line, the Orvis Euro line, which does have a little bit of a taper, fishing dry flies and casting 35 to 45 feet away. And again, what's so cool about these rods is that they require very minimal mass. So because of that, I mean, you can even cast dry flies. It's not easy, but you can cast dry flies with these long, limp rods as long as you have a tapered leader or some kind of mass in that line. You can cast dry flies with that. So usually, like with any time now, this time of the year, where I know I'm going to be probably nymphing early in the day, but the moment I start having fish show on the surface, I like to nymph, but I like dry fly fishing better. So I'm going to immediately switch over to dry flies. And the line I'm using, that Orvis Tactical Nymph line, it's got a little bit of a taper, but I'm using that same leader formula I talked about before, that maybe 4 feet of 12-pound test, a cider material, and then my tippet. But I can easily cast smaller dry flies as long as you're not dealing with 40-mile-an-hour winds. But with that 3-weight rod, you can cast 30 to 45 feet away. You really can. So that is one of the beautiful things about these rods. When you put that with a lightweight line, you can actually cast a decent amount of distance with dry flies for sure. And with streamers, I love the streamer game, and I think this is, again, talking about something that isn't relatively new, but people are talking about more and more. But it's just Euro jigging with streamers. It's like anything else. What Joe will tell you is the difference between a good nymph fisher and an okay nymph fisher is like one split shot. He'll tell you that. And that's the thing I love about Joe. There's just a couple truths that he talks about, and those truths apply just about in every situation. But I think the same thing happens with streamer fishing is, I love throwing large streamers along the bank and just ripping them and just seeing fish come out and chase. But for a fact that there are only so many days and situations and time of the day where fish are willing to actually chase long distances and chase down the food. So when they're not aggressively pursuing bait fish, you have got to slow things down and put it in that strike zone, get it closer to them, and initiate some sort of contact to the point where you're going to create a fight or a flight response. In the European nymphing approach, with a jig, heavily weighted flies or a heavier weighted jig fly is great. The flies I like to use are basically variations of like a Crelex, but the big thing is they're synthetic. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is, before in the past, some of my initial thoughts about nymphing with streamers is I wanted the wool pattern. I wanted materials that could absorb water, sink down to the bottom. It definitely sunk down the bottom, but when you start jigging a wool head streamer, it feels like you're pulling a wet sock to the water column. There's a disconnect. And when you watch the bass anglers fish, when they're jigging, they're jigging with plastics. And when those plastics jig, they just smoothly go through the water column without that friction. So I just thought, well, why the hell am I throwing these wool head streamers and it feels like I'm pulling a wet sock? I'm losing a lot of that contact. So just doing what the bass anglers are doing, taking synthetics, whether it's all, basically like flash material, like basically like a sparkle metal. But when you cast, these flies will quickly penetrate down to the water column. They're thin in profile, but when I'm jigging them, because there's no water absorbing materials or properties, they just smoothly move to the water column. And the moment a fish strikes, you're going to feel that strike. And the thing about jigging is that your strikes sometimes can be aggressive, but it's just like nymph fishing. You're just moving that nymph, that streamer up and down. And it's not like you're pulling that thing through Mach speed and the fish comes out and grabs it. You're going to feel it. You're just jigging this thing up and down. When the fish strikes, often the takes are going to be subtle. So you want a fly that can smoothly move through that water column. And the moment that resistance comes in contact, you're going to feel that. And I feel that any streamer that you jig should have, water-phobic characteristics that are going to shed water and give you that heightened sense of sensitivity when you're just moving that streamer up and down.
Great answer, and things derived from others. I remember, be 18 years ago, being out in Wyoming, and them showing me about how they love to use woolly buggers under indicators up against the banks and how effective it was. And nobody was doing it at the time. It wasn't that common for people to do it. It was out west, but out east, nobody was doing it under an indicator. And they would sometimes even do it with a big Chernobyl ant or something, big foam thing. And they put not a weighted woolly bugger, but just something and dead drifted underneath. And it was amazing how effective it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're basically doing what, what Joe taught me years ago. He grew up in Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, but he fished streams like Penns Creek. And there were the Roats and the Kurtstetters, which were just deadly fish catchers, but they basically fish minnows and sculpins on the bottom. And that's their approach. And I think, yes, larger trout will chase food items, but often bigger trout, in my experience, are lazy, critters. They don't want to expend energy. You've got to kind of bring the package to them. And I think this upstream presentation, what Joe talked about in this European nymphing jigging approach with streamers, just makes it easy. It makes it an easier choice for larger trout to decide whether or not to take, because basically you're giving it right to them. They don't have to work too hard to grab the food.
So good question from Fly Rod Hiker in Tennessee. He's asking about fishing in the Smoky Mountains, and he fishes very rough, broken water. Yeah. How long does it Euro nymphing work there? I've seen your video. I know it does, but can you talk to him about that?
Well, it works great. I mean, I worked down with the North Carolina fly fishing team after I had a short stint with the U.S. adult team and the youth team. I was contracted to work with the North Carolina team, so I spent a pile of just one wonderful year. I went down to North Carolina a lot of times, working in the Asheville, Boone area. But that technique, when you think about European nymphing technique, I think this technique is designed for waters like, the Carolinas. And what I mean by that is, when you think about indicator fishing and so forth, indicator fishing is great, but when you look at high gradient streams, Rocky Mountains or down the Great Smoky Mountains, when you look at a trout stream from a cross-sectional viewpoint, it's not just level and straight or basically even bottom like you see in a spring creek. There's steep drops. So you may cast up to a head of a riffle that may be 6 inches, but within about 5 or 6 of that feet of that fly drifted, it goes from like 6 inches down to like a plunge pool that's about 7 or 8 feet in depth. And what's cool about the tight line system or this contact European nymphing system, it allows you to follow the contours of the stream bottom. So I can pitch that fly upstream in that shallow run, keep that sighter high off the water. But the moment I go into that drop off, I can pause, I can hesitate, I can let that sighter drop deeper. I can allow my flies to basically follow the contours of the bottom. And when you look at so many of those Rocky Mountain, the Smoky Mountain streams down south, this technique is just dynamite. It works so good. And that is why I think, the United States youth fly fishing team, their base for years was in that area. There's a guy named Paul Bork who coached that team and just did a remarkable job with those kids. But those kids won several gold medals. But most of the work that they did was all in that Smoky Mountain region. And I would say the European technique was probably, I would say, something that they probably did 80, 90% of the time, because it is just so complementary to that water type down there.
If I could add to it, when you're working in those type of waters, the hydraulics, a lot of people don't realize, and thanks to people like Ozzy Wendell, who did a lot of research about hydraulics and river morphology, but looking at how it may be rough up here, but 6 inches below the rough water, there's a pocket of 4 inches and it's not moving very fast. And the trout are sitting down there eating and chomping away, right?
Exactly. And that's a great point, because anytime you put an indicator or a dry fly on that surface, it's going to immediately cause drag, and it's going to pull those nymphs off the bottom. So this is just basically you're dissecting the water with a very thin monofilament, and you're able to cut through that initial surface drag and allow you to keep those flies moving slower and deeper in those very slow pockets that Ozzy has done an amazing job, bringing to the public.
Jeremy asked a question about synthetic materials and what's your favorite for the jig streamers. I know personally, I use a lot of materials, lightweight materials, when I go pike fishing and other types of species, because for the same reasons, Rico Pugliesi's materials, things like that. The guys in saltwater dialed into this a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can't use bunny strip leeches and not blow your sockets out of your arms casting for big fish. So this is the same thing. Can you talk about some of the materials you like to use for those type of streamers?
Yeah, I keep things pretty simple. I mean, for like that Krelix pair, it's a Krynic material. If you just look at Eastern trophies, but it's basically like a flash material. It's a super gaudy pattern, and you think it looks like a light bulb, a Christmas light or a Christmas bulb going down to the water column. But you think about why that works. But if you look at some of your traditional spinners, so forth, Met spinners, it works. But I tend to use that Krynic material for my Krelix patterns, and I use that in silver, gold, and there's also some darker variations I like to use. But then also some of the patterns I use, they're just variations of buggers, but it's not all synthetic. I do make a mistake. I'm sorry, and I apologize, but some of the natural materials, say for example, like marabou, basically is basically water phobic. So one of my favorite streamers, it's a variation of a woolly bugger. I just call it the scalp snack, but all it is just a two-tone marabou tail, usually like a light olive, followed underneath with a light tan. And then I'm using a UV polar chenille, medium or large, and I'm just hackling it. That's it. It doesn't really matter, but the Krynix and the Krelix and that little scalp snack variation and a couple of color schemes is really all I use. But if the truth was to be told, craft fur, any of those materials that you talked about with Enrico, they can all work. So just find something that works for you. But you will be really pleasantly surprised. And again, it's just like the smoothness. When you think about the Perdigon style patterns, all these patterns is just thread body with a little bit of UV coating. And when these flies drop, because they are just slick, they want to slide down to the water column. So any synthetic or even natural material like that marabou that you can just basically attach to a fly and allow it to plummet, they're all going to work for you. So find what works for you, but those two work pretty well for me, and I have confidence.
George, you mentioned something that people, especially in the West, might not know about the Eastern Trophy. Because I've certainly met the people from that place at the Edison Fly Fishing Show. Could you explain who they are and what the materials they have? Because I bought poppers from them, streamers, types of stuff from them.
Yeah, so the Krelix pattern I use, it's a pattern made by the late Chuck Kraft, who just passed away not too long ago. But basically, it's it's a fly shop ran by a very nice guy that is a school teacher and just sells fly tying materials on the side. But yeah, just Eastern trophies. And anytime you're looking at like saltwater, warm water applications, synthetic suedes, suede material for like overwings on your crayfish patterns, it is one of the best resources for that type of thing. And just incidentally, they also sell like skeins. I mean, just basically skeins of this chronic material that, I mean, it costs $20, but you buy that and you will have a lifetime supply of Creelix material for you. So
one of the questions being asked, I can't believe it, we're almost an hour already. It's amazing how time goes when you're talking about stuff you love to talk about. But if people want to see more, can you tell them what your YouTube channel is? Is it George Daniel?
Yeah, correct. I just started the YouTube channel just because, like 3 months ago, because of the Penn State. I teach at Penn State, and I needed to do some sort of virtual fly fishing trip, so I created a YouTube channel. So I'm starting to do some YouTube stuff. It's kind of helped. It's taken off a little bit, but it's just, I think, George Daniel on YouTube, George Daniel Fly Fishing YouTube, and there's a number of videos out there. And then normally, anytime I post, George Daniel Fly Fishing at Instagram.com is usually where I'll kind of like let people know if anything comes out. That will be usually the first warning. And then also my website. If you look at my website, there's a blog. I contribute, some articles, some videos too every month, and that's just Living on the Fly, LIVIN on the fly, and that's one source of information you can gather as well. And
of course, let's not forget this.
Yep, absolutely.
So you can see these are the markers for where I'm still going to go back and study more. I love video, obviously, but I also love books because you can get into a lot more detail and the nuances of these techniques, and then combine that with your going on the water and putting in an application. I'll tell you what I'm doing, George. Where I live, I don't have a lot of trout. I have to travel a little bit to get to the trout. And for me, I can go over the local river, and we've got lots of panfish. I've got smallmouth, stuff like that. I'm doing these techniques on these small little rock bass, bluegills, smallmouth bass, and I'm catching fish, but I'm getting that feel and learning how to do this. I mean, I'd love to live where you are down in the State College area, but I don't. And for those people who don't, I mean, this is still a deadly technique for any type of species, right?
I agree. And to be honest with you, my son, I mean, he's only 9 years old, but he's probably just as good at strike detection, if not better than I am. And I think one of the first things we have a farm pond on our property, but I think one of the best things I did to kind of teach him the basically applications of just watching that sighter, not waiting to feel the strike, but actually looking to see the strike, is take him to a farm pond, casting those flies out with your traditional European nymphing jig, and just kind of just moving that fly out, and then you'll just kind of just jig those streamers along. And panfish, they're aggressive, but when they strike, they're not going to rip the fly out of their hand. They're just going to inhale the fly, and you'll see that line just hesitate. But what's cool about that is if you're able to do that with panfish, you can get hundreds of panfish in the course of a day doing that. But you develop memory with basically muscle memory with your hand and also your mind. So the moment that line hesitates, you just instinctually set the hook. And because my son has been able to do that with hundreds and hundreds of panfish, he just knows instinctually the moment that line just hesitates, he just immediately sets a hook. So great point. I think pond fishing, river fishing for warm water species, perch, I think is probably one of the best practices because you get immediate feedback from the fish. Whereas sometimes in trout fisheries where I'm at, I could be out fishing for 2 hours and think I'm doing everything right and still get zero feedback. So right there is, I think doing for those species is probably one of the best things you can do to heighten your sense of strike detection.
Thanks, George. I appreciate you reinforcing that. And there's there's so many questions here, which what I expected. Do you mind staying for a few more minutes?
Sure, we can do a few more minutes. Yep.
I know you got a bright and early day again tomorrow, right?
I do. Yep.
So one of the questions being asked is the pros and cons of different diameter sighting sighter tippet. What are the reasons for that?
So pros and cons. I mean, big thing obviously is larger diameters. You have a larger focus area. You can see things a lot better with larger diameters. But just like in anything else, the smaller in diameter you go, the more sensitive it is. So no matter what monofilament, color monofilament you're doing, if you're fishing with like an OX or like a 1X, excuse me, it's a thicker, fairly stiffer monofilament. You're not going to see as much life in a thicker monofilament. Whereas this stuff, this is just 2X SA mono or cider material, but every company now has a 2X, or even they go down to 4X. But when you're doing this, I mean, this stuff right here, when you're watching this, you can just see how sensitive this is. It is incredibly light. It's limp. And the moment a fish strikes, I mean, that's it. You're just watching that thing just tighten up. You're going to set the hook. So larger, you can see it better, but definitely that smaller diameter is going to give you, when your flies are actually drifting the column, you're just going to see those flies, just that nervous little twitch. And you're going to be able to see that nervous twitch tighten up so much easier with smaller diameter models, just because, in my opinion, the litness of that smaller diameter.
We should say a word about the video you made with Tom Rosenbauer. We had the pleasure of actually shooting with Tom and you on the Farmington River in Connecticut a year and a half ago. And from that, combined with some other shooting that we did, Tom was able to put together a great video with you that goes over the basics of getting into Euro Nymphing and how to get started. If you go to our YouTube channel, or if you go to the Orvis Guide to Fly Fishing YouTube channel, you can see it. George, I hope you're going to add to your YouTube channel. It's a great resource. Of course, you got lots of time in your hands, so I'm sure that won't be a problem for you. And then that actually begs another question. Are you thinking about another book to take this to the next level?
Well, I did come up with another book. It's called Nymph Fishing, New Angles and Tactics. So a lot of what we're talking about here, at least the progression, because anything, I mean, that dynamic nymphing book is a great book. The nymphing book is what I've really have learned in the last 2 or 3 years. And just like any instructor, any teacher I go to, people that I hire to get a certain, I'm hoping at some point in their career, when I come back to them 2 or 3 years later, there's something else that they are working on. So basically, Nymphing New Angles and Tactics is a newer resource, and it's a newer mindset. Still the same principles in dynamic nymphing, but it just also goes into a little finer detail with some of the more modern tools that we have available to us today as well. Okay.
And like I said, you've got 32 minutes spare every day. I'm sure you can crack another book off as you learn more. I'm only joking. But actually, I always look forward to new books from accomplished anglers such as yourself, because, I mean, that's why I call it the new fly fisher. Every time I think I understand something, whether it's bass fishing or dry fly fishing, I learn something new, whether it's because of geography, the river, or the techniques that people are teaching me and the flies are using.
No, absolutely. And even like another great resource. I mean, I have friends, Lance Egan, Devin Olson. I mean, they came out with 2 videos, Modern Nymphing and Modern Nymphing Elevated. Those are 2 great resources. Lance and Devin, both former competitors, teammates of mine. Anything they put out is great information. So I would definitely highly recommend anything on that side. Another guy that I know, Dominic Swintoski, he's got a blog called Trout. That's also a pretty good resource. So, I think some of my information is good, but also just like anything else, I think it's very important. When I have people come to me for instruction, I actually try to promote them to also go to some other instructors. So hopefully, with my views, I think of myself as pretty flexible. I'm always adjusting, making things, but I'm still stuck in my ways in many ways, like we all are once we do things long enough, but trying to get a more, well-rounded view. So if you look at some of those resources as well, like Trout Bidden, Modern Nymphing, Modern Nymphing Elevated, along with some of my stuff, I think that would that covers a lot of the bases, and hopefully will give people basically a great framework to continue working with this technique or getting started with this technique as well.
So a question for you as we're about to close here. What's the largest brook trout you've caught?
Largest brook trout I've caught, it's about 13.5 inches on my local water. That's the biggest brook trout I've ever caught.
So for everyone's information, we're hoping the border's going to open up. I want to get George up north, and I want to get him into a 5 to 8 pound brook trout. I want to see his face, whether it's dry fly or Euro Nymphing, just to see. I can't tell you the pleasure I had taking Tom Rosenbauer to Labrador and watching. Same thing. I think he told me his biggest brook trout was 15 inches, and when he caught his first 7 pound brook trout, the look on his face. On a topwater mouse pattern too. So that was even a little more special.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So we're, for everyone's information, we're trying to get George to come up. Again, he wants to, and we're hoping this is going to happen. It's all about timing. And obviously, we're all waiting for the border to open up and opportunity to come about. And we also would like to hopefully do some stuff with you and as well Bill Humphreys in the future. Again, trying to give you all more information and education, because that's what we love about this outdoor activity. I don't want to call it sport, but an outdoor activity is that not only is it fun, not only is it relaxing, not only is it you have to focus to catch fish, which takes your mind off all your problems, but it's also because it gets you outdoors and you're always learning. Like George, you said it so well. I mean, every time you think you know something and you've written this book, and then like 2 years later, it's like, wow, I could add 4 more pages to that chapter about this, or I could do this. And I've learned that the way I was doing that thing was good, but there's a better way to do it.
Absolutely.
Isn't that wonderful about fly fishing?
It is, and that's what I enjoy. My students, basically my guests that I, guide every day. I learn a lot from them, and tell you, teaching at Penn State, learning from these kids. A lot of these kids, 80%. I had 120 kids last semester. There's like 80% of them are engineers. So when I'm explaining something to them, there's been a couple of them really sharp cookies that say, how about, have you ever thought about this? I'm like, I haven't, and that's a great idea. So that's really what keeps me just loving what this whole activity is about. It's just a constant lifelong learning, spending time with other people, learning from them, and then also just, learning from the environment. And, unlike golf and some of these other activities, great activities, but the great thing about fly fishing is you are fishing a dynamic system. Things are always changing. There's never one river is going to give you 365 different faces throughout the course of the year. And it's just your job to try to hopefully solve the problem. Sometimes it's a very simple jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes it's one of those 2,000 piece puzzles that just takes you ever to figure out. But as you said, that's what kind of keeps it interesting and just makes it so much enjoyable for all of us.
Well, George, thank you very much for being on tonight's event. And I'd like to hopefully have you back, if you don't mind. We're gonna probably discontinue this very shortly. It's just, we're all gonna get into the summer season and we're gonna be busy. We just wanted to see how well this was received. We've only just our 3rd one, and thank you for being on this 3rd Facebook Live event. And our hope is that we'll start up again in November, and we'll have people such as yourself on, and we'll do a little more on trying to answer all the questions everyone's posed here. My apologies for not doing a very good job. There's just so many, which is what I thought would happen. And just to conclude, I just want to say, make sure you get a chance. I gotta do this right away. There's your book. But I do recommend you get the books, George. That I'm like 4 chapters in that, barely, and I keep going back. I'm learning so much. You've done a really good job in the books, really good job on camera, and I look forward to getting on the water with you hopefully this summer. Thank you very much for being on.
No, thank you, and it's a pleasure and honor, and thanks for everyone to spend their evening with us. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. Good night, everyone, and take care.
Take care.